Alright, so this is a quick video about some basic watercolor techniques. The first thing I'm going to do is start with a wash, and so I'm taking just clean water with a clean brush and getting the paper wet. And then I'm going to add a little bit of color. So my brush is wet and I'm just taking a little bit of color. I'm not taking a ton of it. And I'm adding it to the wet area of the paper. Then you can clean your brush off and just drag out the color to create a gradient. And you can make it as dark or light as you want. You can come back in here and make it darker if you think it needs to be darker. And then if you want to erase, there's a couple ways to do it. I cut up my old t-shirts and I use them as rags, so you can use a paper towel or an old t-shirt or rag and you can blot it up. You can also use a clean brush, so I'm just rinsing out my brush, drying it off a little bit on the rag, and then picking up the color like that. So pretty simple. I want to show you the salt technique, which adds a pretty cool effect. And this is just regular old table salt. And I'm dripping it into the wet paint. So you can experiment with how wet your paint is when you're doing that. This is something I use a lot for digital textures, for backgrounds and overlays in my digital illustrations and lettering. I think it adds a really nice handmade effect to digital art. All right, I'm gonna make another section of pretty wet paint here. And then let's see if I'm gonna take a smaller brush, get it wet, and add some of another color. And this color is also very wet, and you can see how it's blending in to the color that's already down there. So you can play around with blending it in a lot or dropping in some pretty dark pigment and getting a really nice effect there. Now if you want a more crisp line, you want to use as little water as possible. You don't want it to be totally dry because that will cause cracking and not be so great with the watercolor medium. So I'm just taking this from the part on my palette that doesn't have a lot of water and making clean, crisp lines. See, you need a little bit of water to make it come through. And this I generally would do at the end of a painting. You can see what it looks like when you add that drier paint into wet paint. Okay, the next thing I'm going to show you is a fun splattering technique. So this is an old toothbrush. You can buy a new one if you think using an old toothbrush is gross. Just don't use it on your teeth again. So I'm filling it up with paint, a little water, not too much water. And literally just taking my thumb and splattering it. This looks really cool. I have some digital textures saved. I scan them. I make pages like this all the time and scan them and use them for all kinds of graphic design and digital art and illustration. So you can obviously do that with any color. Your finger will get a little dirty, but that's okay. All right, and then the next thing is using alcohol. Get some blue down here. So the same way the salt is kind of absorbing the water, the alcohol is going to push the water away. So I'm just using regular rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip, getting the Q-tip wet with alcohol, and this can create kind of fun little bubbles, all kinds of effects. It can create some great texture. It's basically just pushing the watercolor out of the way. And yeah, so just experiment with how wet your paint is and how dry it is. You know, you can get really dark with dry paints and it gets lighter the The more transparent, the more water you use. So you want to start with these light washes and then build up layers of darker and darker paint. And you can let the wash, experiment with letting the washes dry in between or not letting them dry. And then the salt, I have another piece of paper over here. And when the salt is dry, well, this one isn't totally dry, basically just scrub it off into the garbage, and you can start to see what's happening with that. And I usually let it dry for a couple hours. I just will do that at the end, towards the end, or do it in layers and let it dry and work on something else while I'm letting that salt dry, because the longer you let it dry, the less it will smear and the better it will look. But you can kind of see what's happening there with the salt. All right, have fun.